Hello, now we're going to continue our work in algebra, and today we are looking at factorizing. So whenever we're doing any kind of factorizing or simplifying work, what we're always going to look for first is common factors. Is there a factor that is common to every term we're dealing with? Or if we're dealing with fractions, is there a fraction common to all of the top line or all of the bottom line? That is always what we're going to look for before we try to do any other type of factorizing. And then we will work from there. So as an example, if we have 12ab squared plus 16ab, I can see that I have some things that are common to both of these terms. So I am going to look for what is common in the numbers first, then what's common in each individual letter. So that's the stages I'm going to go through. So what's the highest common factor between 12 and 16? It's going to be 4. The highest common factor in my letters, well, I have an A in both. I have a b squared in my first term and I have a b in my second term, so the highest common factor is b. And now I'm going to fill in my bracket here. So I have my common factor written here. I open up my bracket and then I ask myself a question. What would I have to multiply 4ab by to end up with 12ab squared? I would have to multiply it by 3b. And then likewise with my second term, what would I have to multiply 4ab by to end up with 16ab? I would have to multiply it by plus 4. The other way of phrasing this, if you prefer it, is to say, to figure out what this term is going to be, you'd have 12ab squared divided by 4ab, and you would get 3b as your answer. So that's the other way of working out what should go in your bracket. But this is a key skill, and again, common factor comes first. This is always what we're going to look for before we try anything else. So if we have a look at our second example here, we have 2c squared minus 2d minus 4cd plus c. So I'm going to see if I have a common factor between my first two terms. It's what I'm going to do. If I have 4 terms here, I'm going to look and see, can I get a common factor between the first 2 terms and the second 2 terms? And this skill here can be seem a little bit arbitrary, but we use it as part of solving our quadratic equations later on. So that's why it's particularly important. Now, if I look here, I can see I have a common factor of 2. And then I'd end up with c squared minus d. And I have a common factor of c here, so I'd end up with minus 4d plus 1. And I've run into a problem. What I've done here is technically valid. It's just that it doesn't get me where I want to. It doesn't allow me to continue my factorizing. So instead of trying to factorize the first 2 terms and the second 2 terms, I'm going to rearrange. If we've forgotten from Junior Cert, I'll remind you now, what we would be aiming for is to end up with my 2 brackets having the same terms in them. So ending up with identical brackets when we take out our common factors from the first 2 terms and the second 2 terms. That's what we'd like to see. That's not what I'm seeing here. So I'm going to go back and see if I can rearrange my terms to get factors in a way that I like. And usually all you have to do is rearrange your middle 2 terms or swap the terms around in whatever way you like, and you will usually find that the question works out the way you want it to. So now I'm going to try doing my job again. I'm going to try taking in the common factor from the first 2 terms and the second 2 terms, and now that I've reordered things, I'll see if that ends up nicer than it did before. So I can see I have a common factor of 2c for my first 2 terms, and I'm left with c minus 2d. And I don't have any common factor that I can see here, but I know that every single number has a factor of 1. So I can take out a factor of plus 1. I end up with minus 2d plus c. Even though these are in a different order, I still have a minus 2d and a plus c. So these brackets are identical, even though we've swapped the order, so they're all right. And now I take out my common factor, which is my bracket, so c minus 2d, and I end up with 2c plus 1. And that gets me my factorization done. So if I get 4 terms, first step is to try getting what's common to the first 2 terms and the second 2 terms. If that doesn't work, swap the order around a little bit. So that didn't work, so swap the order around a little bit, and then we can get down to the point where we have 2 brackets, which is usually what we're aiming for in that type of question. Next type, we're in the top right hand corner of the screen. I have 8a squared minus 18b squared. What jumps out at me instantly? I have a squared term minus a squared term, but I don't have perfect squares for my numbers. So I'm suspecting that I have dots, that I have difference of 2 squares, but I don't have it yet. So what am I always going to try first? I'm going to try common factor comes first. So is there a common factor between my 2 terms? And there is. I can see that I have a common factor of 2. Sorry, what am I writing? I have a common factor of 2. So if I take out my common factor of 2, I'm left with 4a squared minus 9b squared. And now I can see that I've got a standard difference of 2 squares type situation going on in this bracket. So I'm going to rewrite it as perfect squares. So 4a squared is the same as 2a all squared minus 9b squared is the same as 3b all squared. Now I have a squared minus b squared, and I know that a squared minus b squared is equal to a plus b multiplied by a minus b. I know that it factorizes that way, and I know that that's something that's important that I need to remember when I'm doing my maths. Anytime I can spot something squared and a minus, I'm instantly thinking, could I have dots on my hands? And then I have 2a minus 3b multiplied by 2a plus 3b. As we've discussed previously, you could see this written either way around, so I'm deliberately writing it in more than one way to highlight that to you. It's perfectly valid to say a minus b multiplied by a plus b as well. Now, that's our difference of 2 squares. The last thing we're going to talk about right now is how to factorize a quadratic expression. This comes in very important later on when we're talking about the roots of functions or the roots of equations, where they cross the x-axis, but right now we're doing it in terms of an expression. I'm going to show you one way now, and we're going to have a look at another way very soon. So the first method we're going to look at is spotting patterns. This method is very important because it gets your eye in for spotting patterns in numbers, which is extremely important at higher level. So what we do is multiply the number in front of the x squared and multiply the constant on the end, and I find that I get plus 6 as the result. Now what I'm going to do is look for the factor pairs that multiply together, numbers that multiply together to give plus 6. So I could have 1 by 6, or I could have 2 by 3, or I could have minus 1 by minus 6, or minus 2 by minus 3. Doing this out the long way is very good for getting your eye in for patterns in numbers and factors of numbers that you can really use in certain parts of the course. So even though it takes a moment to write out all of the different possible combinations, it's helpful for getting your head into higher level maths. So it's not something you want to skip over. This is a very useful skill for being able to spot patterns in numbers moving forward. So now what I'm looking for is what combination of numbers is going to add together to give my minus 7. So I want 2 numbers that multiply together to give the numbers on the end and add together, sum together, to give the coefficient of the x. And what I can see is I have minus 1 minus 6 multiplies together to give the same result as 2 by 3, or to give 6, and it adds together to give minus 7. And what I'm going to do is factorize this out. I end up with minus 1x minus 6x plus 3. So I have effectively split up my minus 7x into minus 1x minus 6x. This adds together to give minus 7x, so I haven't changed my sum. I've just changed the way it looks in order to make my factorization easier. And now that I've done that, I'm in a position where I'm going to look for what's common to the first two terms and what's common to the second two terms. So what's common to the first two is x. So I end up with 2x minus 1. What's common to the second two is obviously 3. But if I'm being clever, if I take out plus 3, I'd end up with minus 2x plus 1, which isn't what I want. I want the same thing in both of these brackets. I want this to be the same as this. So what can I do in order to change the sign in my second bracket? I can take out minus 3 as a common factor instead of plus 3. So if I do that, if I take out minus 3 as my common factor, I end up with minus 3 by what gives me minus 6x, it's 2x, and minus 3 by what gives me plus 3, minus 1. So now I find that I have my second bracket is the same as my first, so I have a common factor, 2x minus 1, and then x minus 3 is my remaining factors. X minus 3 is my remaining factor. So this is the first way, this is the patterns way of finding the factors of a quadratic, and again, very important for developing skills in spotting patterns in numbers. So that's what we need to be practicing for our factorizing for right now.